Just some reminders. The demand curve is used to describe the consumer's behavior. So for a certain product, the demand and the price are obviously strongly related, and traditionally the price is described as a function of the demand. In other words, for a known value of the demand, we can then interpret or predict the price that would be associated to that demand. The demand curve is usually the result of statistical surveys, which is the scatter plot that you see in this graph. So as we draw the trend line through the scatter plot, one can determine the demand curve, and essentially when the price decreases, we can expect the demand to increase. On the other hand, the supply curve is used to describe the producer's behavior. Again, for the same product, the supply and the price are dependent. Traditionally, the price is described as a function of the supply. So, for a given quantity, we can then determine the price to meet that supply. Once again, the supply curve is usually the result of statistical analysis, and here we have a scatter plot through which we drew the best fit curve, which is the supply curve. Generally speaking, the supply will increase as the price increases because suppliers are more than willing to supply more elements if they can sell it at a higher price. Now, market equilibrium in a competitive market will be established whenever the supply and the demand intersect. Whenever the supply curve and the demand curve intersect, we will denote by XE the quantity at which equilibrium is obtained, and as PE the equilibrium price. For example, Watch Me Go is an affordable smartwatch well equipped with apps for those who do triathlons. The supply and demand curves for this product are given by the equations that you see below. To find the market equilibrium point, you will essentially use algebra and equate the supply and demand and isolate X. Keep in mind that X here represents quantities, and that when you replace X by 250, in this case, into the supply and demand curve, you will obtain the equilibrium price at which these watches are sold. Graphically, here's a representation for the supply and the demand curves, and we can tell that their intersection occurs at an equilibrium price of $55 and at an equilibrium quantity of 250 units. Consumer surplus is the area in the interval from 0 to XE that is located between the demand curve and the equilibrium price. In the graph shown below, we have shaded the region that represents the consumer surplus. Now, to calculate the consumer surplus, one can simply use an integral. dx minus PE is basically an area calculation as done in the previous video. D of x is the higher of the two functions. PE represents the lower portion of each Riemann sum rectangles, and therefore dx minus PE times dx represents area. The integral itself takes care of adding up all of these rectangles' areas. Now, one way of interpreting the consumer surplus is to remember that some individuals were actually willing to pay more than what the market established as the equilibrium price. These individuals are the ones that you find before XE equals 250. For these individuals, a surplus is realized because, again, extra money is left in their pocket, which they can then invest or spend on other economic elements. Producer surplus is the area over the same interval, 0 to XE, that is located between the supply curve and the equilibrium price. It is shaded in the region that you see below and can tell that it's between PE and S of X. Once again, to compute producer surplus, you would simply use area functions as seen in the previous video. P of E equals 55 in this case is the higher part of each rectangle, and its lower border is determined by S of X. Now these rectangles can be shifted left to right from x equals 0 to x equals 250 to cover the span of the whole area. Interpreting producer surplus requires that we just think of suppliers who were willing to charge less than the price that was actually established at equilibrium. As you can tell in the graph, at first, S of X is below the equilibrium price. For these companies, a surplus is realized, which they can then invest into their own companies or on their own economic needs. Back to our previous example, Watch Me Go is an affordable smartwatch well equipped with apps for those who run, bike, and swim. The supply and demand curves for this product are given by the functions that we described before and whose equilibrium point occurs at the coordinate x equals 250 and p equals 55. We shall now compute the consumer and producer surpluses obtained from this situation. First and foremost, consumer surplus is the area that lies between the equilibrium price and the supply curve. Therefore, we will integrate the demand curve minus the equilibrium price. 80 minus 0.1 of x was the expression for the demand. 55 was the price at equilibrium. The difference will help us find the space between the two lines we described before. In this case, $3,125 would be extra savings for these consumers who would have been willing to spend more for the watch than what was determined by the market price. Producer surplus is the area located between the supply curve and the equilibrium price before the equilibrium quantity is obtained. We can set it up by subtracting from the equilibrium price the supply curve, whose expression was 42.5 plus 0.05x, and integration over the region 0 to 250 will then give us a result of $1,562.50. This money actually represents extra earnings for the companies who had been willing to sell the product at a lower price than what was established by the equilibrium of the market. So these are extra earnings that companies can then invest into their own companies. As you can tell from the graphs, it's not surprising in our example that the producer surplus was not as big as the consumer surplus. Now you want to avoid the two numbers because in fact both of them are good news. The consumer surplus probably represent values or investments or money that consumers will spend somewhere else. Producer surplus is extra money made by producers, by companies who will reinvest it into their own companies. So this is, I guess, what we would consider a win-win situation.